Karl Rudolf von Rundstedt, nicknamed the Last Prussian. Possibly one of the German marshals who participated in the most battles and military operations during World War II. However, he does not have the charisma or fame of other marshals such as Rommel, Manstein, Model, or even Kesselring. In addition, he was one of the worst Wehrmacht officers who finished after the end of the war. Next, in this program, we are going to analyze his extensive service record, in which we are going to see how a man who by age should have already been retired, was one of the most important marshals of the Third Reich. Well, with that said, let's get started. Von Rundstedt ended the First World War with the rank of major, after having been chief of staff of various army corps. During the interwar period, Rundstedt is one of the German officers in charge of the reorganization of the new German army, which after the imposition of the Treaty of Versailles, had been limited to 100,000 soldiers. These restrictions will be progressively abolished by Hitler once he comes to power in 1933, and Rundstedt will be part of this new process of rebuilding the Wehrmacht. In 1938, at the age of 63, Colonel General Rundstedt voluntarily retired from the army with the aim of retiring and being calm during his last years. However, it was going to be during the next few years that he was going to have the most important actions of his life. It was specifically in May 1939, just a few months after the German attack on Poland, when Rundstedt was called up for service, ending his short period of retirement. And it is that due to his great experience, someone like him could not be dispensed with for the future war that was coming. Thus, after participating in the preparation of the attack plan on Poland, known as the White Case, on August 23 Rundstedt was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group South, von Manstein being one of his main assistants. In this way Rundstedt had the 8th, 10th, and 14th armies under his command, which were the protagonists of the two great pincers that made their way through Poland from the south and defeated it in less than a month. After this operation, Rundstedt was appointed military governor of Poland, and commander-in-chief of the German armies that are in the eastern sector of the Reich, which now included half of Poland. This position did not last long because he was quickly sent to the Western Front, where, as we recently saw in a program, Hitler had given the order to attack France on November 12 of that same year, 1939. So for October 25, Rundstedt is appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group A, which was located at the height of the Ardennes Forest. Again counting on Manstein, who was the one who developed the plan to attack France through the Ardennes to isolate most of the Allied armies north of the Somme River, Rundstedt was in charge of the armies that carried out this action through the Ardennes. This brilliant campaign that again concluded with the defeat of another great country like France in barely a month and a half, led him to be one of the generals that was promoted by Hitler during the ceremony on July 19, 1940, and obtained the rank of Field Marshal. In France he briefly held the post of Western Commander-in-Chief again, until again in April 1941, he was given command of Army Group South for the impending attack on the Soviet Union. This German attack on the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, was the third major military operation of the Wehrmacht in which this elderly marshal once again participated. Rundstedt's Army Group South was the unit that had the hardest time, because most of the Soviet armies were in the sector now occupied by present-day Ukraine. Even so, his armies forced their way through these Ukrainian plains and pocketed hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, being a key player in the conquest of Kiev during the month of September. Army Group South then continued to advance until reaching Rostov on November 21. Up to this date, all had been victories for Rundstedt since he had started the war, but it was now that he was to suffer his first setback. Only 6 days after occupying the city, the Soviets attacked the sector with force, and forced the Germans to withdraw, in breach of Hitler's orders. With winter almost upon us, this was the first time the Germans had to abandon a major city on the Eastern Front, and it set off all the alarm bells. After a visit by Hitler to the Rundstedt barracks on the Eastern Front, the old marshal is relieved of command, and is sent to the reserve on December 1. Just 4 days later, a Soviet counteroffensive began along the entire front, which gave Rundstedt the reason for the need to paralyze the advance and entrench. After spending 4 months without any occupation, in March 1942, Rundstedt was appointed commander-in-chief of the German army in the West. This was more or less the date that work to fortify the Atlantic Wall began, given the need for Germany to protect its back while fighting against the Soviet Union continued in the following years. Let us remember that at the end of 1941, in addition to the German failure to obtain Stalin's surrender, the United States had formally entered the war after being attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. In this way, the Germans knew that sooner or later the Americans were going to intervene in Europe, and they had to be prepared. This was the position in which Rundstedt spent the longest, in a more or less quiet life away from the bloody Eastern Front. Even so, and despite criticism from his colleagues, the old Prussian never relaxed, and did everything possible to have the defenses on the Atlantic Wall ready for when the Allies decided to intervene. At the end of 1943, Rundstedt sent a message to Hitler, advising him that defensive construction along the Atlantic coast was far behind schedule, and requesting more material and soldiers. The German leader took the notice of his marshal very seriously, and sent Rommel to the sector, also giving priority to the Western Front with his Directive No. 51 for the shipment of all kinds of supplies. From this moment on, and despite the fact that Rommel was subordinate to Rundstedt, both men competed for the organization of the German defenses on the Western Front. Once the Normandy landings took place and the Allies consolidated their beachhead in northwestern France, Rundstedt was quite pessimistic, and after several defeatist comments, he was again dismissed from his post during the last days of June. Basically, he told Keitel that victory was impossible, and that the only thing they could do was negotiate a peace. After the collapse of the Normandy front, the suicide of Kluge, who was the one who had replaced him, and the heavy workload that Walter Model had to manage the entire Western Front, Rundstedt is called up again for service, and takes charge of the Western Front again from September 1, 1944. Occupying this position, he had to be in charge of the defense of the Siegfried Line and later of the Rivera del Rhine, in addition to the offensive that the Germans launched again through the Ardennes in December 1944. He lost his last position of military responsibility on March 11, after the Allied crossing of the Remagen Bridge, and he was then appointed Chief of the Reserve. However, after again suggesting that the only thing to do was make peace with the Allies, he was fired for good. With this we have that when the Second World War came to an end a month and a half later, the German Marshal was already 70 years old. Once the war ended, Rundstedt was involved in multiple judicial processes that would last until 1949, in which he was tried as a war criminal for some killings of civilians during Operation Barbarossa. As is evident, this process did not help his health much, and during these last years the former marshal suffered great physical and mental deterioration. This led to his finally being released in May 1949, completely stripped of his former money, housing, property, and military pension. In fact, Rundstedt spent the last 4 years of his life living in poverty, trying to reunite with his wife, and giving interviews to historians of the time who took an interest in him. He finally died in Hanover in February 1953 from a new heart attack. Well, what do you think of this marshal? Why do you consider that he is not as famous as other generals despite his huge service record? If you are interested in analyzing how the recent fighting on the Western Front in which Rundstedt was the protagonist was, I leave this documentary in the description.